With that, I'm just going to give you all a quick overview of IATP. So we are fully known as the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. So in brief, IATP is a research and advocacy organization focused on advancing the voices and policies needed to develop a sustainable and fair food and farm system. In brief, if you wanted one sentence about what we do, this sentence on the slide there is what we do. We work to create sustainable food and agriculture systems. So we believe that our current agriculture system, not just in the US, but globally in a lot of situations, is heavily commercialized and dependent on extractive practices which deplete our soil, pollute our air and water, and which we all know is not sustainable. The current system operates at the expense of decent working conditions for millions of people all over the globe. And we partner with other groups and organizations to hold ag business accountable for their harms, identify and lift up the voices and needs of smaller producers. We also produce original research on agriculture-related policy and the impact that they can have to damage or strengthen a sustainable future of food. Ultimately, we're interested in bringing about a just transition to our food and farm systems, and we envision agriculture, trade, and food systems that are good for people, farmers, and food system workers, the ecosystems around us that we all are a part of, and social justice globally. If that sounds like a mouthful, if it sounds layered and complex, it is. The work is a lot. And for that reason, we often emphasize here at IATP that this isn't the work of a single policy, a single administration, or a single government. This is the work of a lifetime. And we appreciate you all joining us in that work today and down the road. So naturally, there's always more we could say about IATP, about these topics. I hope this short intros helped us be all on the same page about what we're about and what we're working on. You can always learn more from our website or from some of the resources we'll share, and of course, in the panel here. So like I said, our topic today is climate solutions and agriculture. So we'll have an introduction from Claire Stockwell, our Director of European Strategy here at IATP. Claire will then introduce our other panelists, Ben Lilliston, the Program Director for Climate Change and Rural Strategies, and Brandon Wu, one of our board members and Director of Policy and Campaigns and Action Aid USA. Brandon, Ben, and Claire, thank you for being here. Thank you to everyone who's joining us in the webinar. Claire, I'm going to send the spotlight to you and let you take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, Colin. And I have to say, for all of those that you put that you had sun in the chat, I'm very jealous because I'm not sure if we're gonna see sun here until the spring, but hunkering down for a long winter. As you may know, our current food system is both a major contributor to the climate crisis, responsible for about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, but also suffers the devastating consequences, which the tragic and deadly flooding last month in Spain illustrate, unfortunately, all too well. And here in Europe, our work on climate change and agriculture focuses on two main areas: how we design and build support for climate policies that work for both farmers and the planet, including a transition away from industrial livestock that cause much of the pollution. And then the second is ensuring that the tax money that we are using to support the agriculture sector is going to the farmers that really need it and supporting farm practices that work within planetary boundaries. And these two pieces of work are really against a backdrop of wanting to ensure that the corporations that are active in the agri-food space are held responsible for for their emissions. Now, as Colin mentioned, this concept of just transition is really sort of central to our work of how we get from the current system that isn't working to one that will work for people and the planet. And before I turn it over to Ben and Brandon today, I wanted to share with you both some recent developments that have happened on this side of the pond, which, dare I say it, may offer a ray of hope in that regard. I'm really trying to take a glass half full approach to things these days, but may also help illustrate a little bit more the types of work that we do in Europe. So you may remember that earlier at the beginning of this year, there were farm protests spread across Europe. And one of the responses to those protests was to establish a dialogue amongst folks across the agri-food chain. And this really ranged from the largest farm lobbies to Greenpeace. And that this group was really supposed to discuss was brought together to really discuss what is the future of European agriculture. They came up with a series of recommendations, which they agreed to by consensus, and that is no small feat, considering the interests that were involved, two of which I thought I would share with you today. The first was the need to plan, and specifically to plan around how we transition to sustainable animal farming, recognizing that we need to focus on areas that have high concentration of livestock, like your factory farms, as this is a great source of pollution, and also that this planning should take place at the local and regional level, given that that's giving power to those that are closest to the problem and best placed to offer the solutions. Plans are great, but you often need money to make them happen. And that was the second recommendation or that this group made, was that we needed funding, and specifically a new fund, which they aptly called the Agri-Food Just Transition Fund, which would be established from what I'll call sort of Europe's answer to the Farm Bill, and that could support farmers through this transition process to a sustainable animal farming system. This fund could really support a range of activities, from reskilling workers to shifting different production systems on farm, maybe looking at completely new business opportunities, and even voluntary farm buyouts. And that all of this would be done in a way that ensures regional agriculture and rural businesses remain viable. At the moment, these are just two recommendations, ideas on a page, but we think they represent approaches that can really help deliver on the just transition. And so they will be a key focus of the work that the Berlin office is doing. So with that very brief postcard from Europe, I think what I hope I've illustrated to you is Europe has started an important discussion about transitioning its agriculture system, one which I think could be helpful and relevant to other countries based on their own context, and also illustrates a little bit the types of things that we're working on over here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ben, our Director of Rural Strategies and Climate, to say a bit more about the work in the US.
Thank you,
Ben,
Claire.
the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here. Great to see everybody and some familiar names there in the chat. I am the Director of Climate and Rural Strategies at IATP, and I'm just going to build out a little bit on what Claire talked about around a just transition. That is the main focus or big focus for IATP, is how do we build a policy framework that makes this transition in agriculture? And what we mean by a just transition is how do we build climate resilience, not only on the farm, build soil health, have more diversified farming that is able to withstand some of the climate challenges that are coming, but also in the food system. How do we not be such a globalized food system that is really controlled by a handful of corporations, and start to diversify that system and build more resilience? We're also focused on reducing emissions. It's a climate crisis. We got to do that. As Claire pointed out, this factory farm system, particularly for animal production, particularly for beef, dairy, and hogs, is a major source of emissions, as is the high use of nitrogen fertilizer for corn production. So what kind of policies can we have to give farmers some more options to transition out of systems that are really dependent and driving those emissions? And then another element for us is fairness in the marketplace. We can't just put all the responsibility on the farmers to make the change, particularly when they're facing a market where they're often not paid fairly in the market. So marketplace fairness, not only for farmers, but for workers in the system. And then empowerment is a really key element to us. It is a corporate controlled system. There's no avoiding that. And these very powerful corporations dictate a lot of what's grown and produced, how it's grown, how much people get paid, and how much consumers pay. So how can we shift that, challenge that corporate power, and bring more empowerment to both countries, but also communities and regions within a food system? So those are the elements that we're looking at when we look at policy. Are they taking us further towards this just transition or not? I will say no doubt that the elections that just took place in the US will affect a lot of our policy advocacy in different ways. If you recall, during the first Trump administration, there was a lot of more activity at the state level, and that can be very exciting in some ways. We will still be able to challenge corporate power under this political environment, and we'll continue to do that and challenge companies to reduce their emissions and to address climate risk. So there'll be a little bit of a pivot, but we still feel like we can make very good progress, as well as what our other countries are doing. As Claire pointed out, countries are learning from each other and thinking about this challenge of climate and agriculture and food. And it's not just the US on its own. So how do we make these changes? What policies are we looking at? So as Clara kind of referenced, money, public spending. How can we shift our public spending to build resilience, reduce emissions? In the US, the Farm Bill is a really big lever for that. And that's in a little bit of a no man's land right now. And happy to dig into more questions about that if people want to go deep into the Farm Bill. But we've been pushing for a lot more conservation spending. We know there's huge demand for farmers to put in conservation practices, including those that can build soil health and diversify the farm. So we're pushing for that. We want to stop public spending for factory farms. And you see that in USDA loans. You see that in some of our conservation spending, some of our renewable energy spending. So we want to shift that money over. We want to see more money for local and community food systems. And we want to see restore some fairness to the marketplace. And that includes transparency as well as empowering farmers and their legal rights really in the marketplace. That's a very broad overview, but how we're looking at public spending. The other aspect is regulation. We need to be able to, factory farm system has really avoided regulation, has a number of exemptions, both for climate emissions, but also clean air, clean water. So we want to have them be treated fairly, really, as other businesses are. And really, they are a factory type of system. They need to be regulated. And so pushing for those types of regulations in the current political environment, we may be looking a little bit more at the state level to try to advance those ideas. We're also looking at just competition issues within the food and ag system, as I mentioned, issues around antitrust, fair contracts for farmers. How do we get better transparency in the marketplace so farmers can really see what the price is that they should be getting paid? Those are just kind of basic things that have really fallen off in our food and ag system that we are focusing on. And then the other is around climate disclosure. Excuse me. There's a lot of momentum among shareholders and investors to encourage companies to disclose more about their emissions, but also their climate risk and what they're going to do about it. And so there's opportunities both at the federal level. We might, run into some challenges under the Trump administration on that. But at the state level, California has really strong climate disclosure rules. New York is looking at that. Europe has those in place now. So that's a real opportunity that we are focused on. Lastly, I'll just mention trade policy. Our current trade agreements do not incorporate climate change in those trade deals. And so, they're basically pretending like it hasn't happened and it's not causing disruptions both to our food system, but also to farmers on the ground in countries around the world. And so we want to make changes in those trade rules to better reflect the climate crisis and to give countries more policy space to be able to respond to that crisis. So I'll wrap up that right there and happy to dig into any of these kind of issues in the questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Collin, Claire, and Ben, and thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Brandon Wu. I'm a IATP board member, and I'm in my day job. I'm the director of policy and campaigns at a group called ActionAid USA. ActionAid is an international development organization. We're active in 70 plus countries around the world, and I wanted to bring into this discussion some of the perspectives from developing countries in the global south. We've heard about Europe a little bit. We've heard about the US. Because climate is a global system, just as the food system is a global system, I think it's important that we think about the entire world. My organization, ActionAid, actually started working on climate precisely because we were hearing from rural communities in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, that climate change was affecting them. Again, this was 20 years ago. I think many of us in the US were thinking about climate back then as a future problem, but it was already directly impacting people, in particular, rural people, farmers, 20 plus years ago. And so things we were hearing were changing rainfall patterns, increasing soil salinity from ocean encroachment, things like that. That people on the ground were not talking about those as climate change problems. But that's what they were, right? And so we, in addition to sort of, working at the local level, we began working at the international level on international climate policy, because we recognized that in a lot of cases, the farmers and the rural communities we were working with knew what they needed to do. Not in all cases, but in many cases, they knew what the solutions were, or at least what sort of some immediate solutions might be, but they lacked the resources, and their local and national governments lacked the resources as well. And so I think it's important when we're talking about climate and food security and food sovereignty, that we talk about climate justice, which is the idea that some of the most vulnerable people in the world to the impacts of climate change are the ones who have done the least to cause the problem. So that, the farming communities or the fisher folk in Bangladesh that we work with are essentially, contributing zero emissions to drive the climate crisis, and yet they're the ones on the front lines of the impacts, and they already were 20 years ago. And so there is an international system by which wealthier countries are supposed to provide support to those communities in the global south who are being directly impacted. We refer to that as climate finance, which is a term I strongly dislike, but that's when we say that, we're referring to just the transfer of resources to support countries and communities in poorer countries to cope with climate change and to take action to address the crisis. There is right now a big UN climate negotiation happening in Baku, Azerbaijan, where one of the big deliverables this year is a global target, a new global target on how much money needs to be flowing from rich countries in the global north to poorer countries in the global south. Obviously, the U.S. election has an impact on that. That's not something that we can avoid talking about, and happy to get into that more. But in the interest of keeping it short, I will say these climate negotiations happen every year. The next one next year is happening in Brazil, and there's going to be a big focus on land and food systems at the climate negotiations next year in Brazil. And I know that we'll be tracking that very closely as IATP, as well as my organization and many others. I think the last thing I'll say is that in the context of climate change and climate policy making, particularly at the international level, agriculture has a unique place. Food systems have a unique place in the policymaking as regards climate, because good agriculture policy can be both good for food security and food sovereignty and good for the climate. And just to preview a little bit, the next session of this webinar series on agroecology, this is the solution we're pushing that's both good for people and good for the climate. Whereas bad agriculture policy is bad for both of those things. And there's a bit of a split where in the climate negotiations internationally, some of the rich countries only want to talk about agriculture as a mitigation solution, that is reducing emissions. That's all they're interested in. Whereas many countries in the global south are saying, look, our overriding priority is making sure that people are fed. And so we can't just talk about agriculture as a way to reduce emissions. We have to also talk about food security and food sovereignty, and making sure that we're centering people and not just climate, as many northern governments and some northern civil society organizations have had a history of doing. So just wanting to flag that as we're talking about climate, we always want to be centering people and the people who are directly impacted as much as possible. I'll stop there, and I think we're going into Q&A, yeah? Thanks.
Yeah, in just a moment. Thank you, Brandon, Ben, and Claire. Claire and Ben, before we get into any questions, I just wanted to check in if you two had any additional comments on anything Brandon has said or anything anyone else has shared in the webinar so far, and then we can get into some questions. Okay, no worries. Well, we've got some great questions here. We'll get through a few of them. We may not get to all of the questions today, but we'll try to follow up with all of you who have been participating. Once again, if you've got further questions, feel free to submit them here in the Q&A. Ben, I know you answered a couple via text already, but I'm going to get into this first one here for you. Teresa was asking, major progress was made by the Biden administration on antitrust and different question, I believe. One of the ones you've answered. A question for you regarding public funding for factory farms at the state level. What are the primary levels you are considering on that?
So at the state level, a lot of the advances in factory farm, the expansion has been built out by taking away local communities and even at the county level, ability to challenge those farms. So we often refer to that as taking away local control, and then simultaneously sort of deregulating rules around water pollution in particular. So Minnesota is a state that does have local control and avenues for citizens to challenge factory farms, and they have had some success. I think Wisconsin does have some local control, but a state like Iowa really does not have any really good avenues to challenge the factory farm system, and they have major water pollution issues. But as do these other states. I mean, it's often a zoning thing and a regulatory thing, not a public funding thing at the state level. But having said that, there are state level funding programs that do support things like what we call factory farm gas, which is basically to put a gas plant on a giant manure lagoon to produce more gas to enter into natural gas pipelines. That is something that's taking off in the Midwest, unfortunately, and a lot of that money is coming from California, but also at the state level. Things like biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels, which are being talked about, all fit into this factory farm system, and states are promoting those and supporting them in various ways. So those are things that we're looking at and trying to really lift up that those approaches are false solutions when it comes to climate change, and in fact, further entrench a highly polluting system.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Someone had the other question here commented on about, are there any tools to reliably measure greenhouse gas emissions from individual farms, and how well do those tools work for the enormous variety of farm operations?
Yeah, I'll just say real quickly, not an expert on this question. I hear the comment tool being used a lot, and I've also heard that it has some real limitations. That's COMET. I think it's at Colorado State, and USDA helped develop that, but it would give you some ideas if that's something you're interested in on your farm. But I'd be interested in what other people think about what is the best measurement tool.
I believe this next question will be a good one for all three of you at some level. So we've noted the importance of local and regional action. How do we best coordinate that through all levels of government? They provided an example here from Toronto of them moving towards a more whole plant-based food system, but the shift is at odds with provincial policy in many respects. Do any of you feel most interested in hopping on that question here?
I guess maybe I can start us off with the view from Europe.
Yeah.
So just going back to this, maybe what I'll outline for you is what was recommended in this dialogue. So this group of stakeholders that was responding to the farmer protests, how they really saw the planning issue. And I think they're, at least for trying to transition to a more sustainable animal farming system, they really looked at it, or they had recommendations that were sort of geared at three levels. The first was sort of developing a strategy, which would be done more at the EU level so that you could have the overarching vision, concrete pathways, know where you were going. That this would then need to be further developed out into actually how you were going to sort of achieve those end goals at a territorial and regional level, looking sort of really concentrating on areas that have a high concentration of livestock. And then specifically that, to access the type of funding that I was talking about at the top, that you would need a business plan at the farm level, so that you really sort of had these three cascading levels of planning that had different sort of levels of specificities and goals, but that would hopefully help everyone know the general direction that they were going into, and then developing the specific nitty-gritty solutions closer to where they would actually be implemented. So at least that was the recommendations. We still have to see and get that moving through the policy making process over here in Europe.
Thanks, Claire. Ben or Brandon, do you want to comment further on that question?
I have two very different responses. One is, in the U.S. context, in the coming years, I think coordination may be the opposite of what we're looking for. As Ben mentioned, I think we're going to be looking at state level policy to be a kind of counterweight to what we know is going to be disastrous federal policy. And I think that's a very powerful tool, both in terms of policy and in terms of being able to organize people. So unfortunately, in the U.S., there's a particular answer to that right now. And the other thing I was going to say was that in coming back to the Global South, some of the work that we have done is, there's an argument that wealthy countries always like to use to avoid having to give money to the Global South, which is, well, what about corruption? And sort of that is an excuse. It is also real to a certain extent, and the way that we have worked in the past, and this is particularly true actually in food and agriculture, is working with communities to do budget education, so that they can look at a national budget and say, hey, there's money in here for extension programs. We haven't seen any of that. And then kind of organize those communities to demand that the money actually flow the way it is supposed to, from the national government to the district or the local government and to people themselves. So in that context, that coordination is actually essential in a country that is that lacks domestic resources and is relying on climate finance, for example. And so that's something that we've thought a lot about in other contexts outside of the US.
Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, I'd just add real quickly, I mean, one of the challenges is that it's not only that we have a political divide in the US that's pretty stark, but also a rural-urban divide. And so I think the role of cities is important in moving forward around climate change and food systems. And I think part of our challenge, though, is to build bridges between rural communities and to think about how that can benefit a state as a whole, or a province as a whole, or a region as a whole. One of the avenues that we've been working on very deeply for at least a decade is around farm to institution programs and expanding them and building them that have support in rural areas as well as urban areas, and how to better connect farmers to public spending and public purchasing. It's a challenge when you have a corporate controlled system that is designed to push prices down, kind of a race to the bottom in terms of the food and what it pays farmers. But that is one avenue to place a different set of values into the food system and to bring larger benefits than just to the children who are eating, but also to the farmers and the communities that are supplying the food.
Thank you, Ben. Brandon, there was a question in the chat earlier asking just for more clarification on action aid a little bit here. Do you work with farmers in Africa to address frequent dry spells after planting? If that is something that action aid works on, or if you have some comments kind of around that, do you mind sharing?
Yeah, I mean, we have active program work, I don't know where if the question is specific to a country. So I'd be happy to follow up with anyone who's interested. We do have active work with rural communities in many countries around the world. So again, I would need a little more specifics, but
yeah, cool. Thanks, Brandon. So yeah, just to follow up with that person, they do have specific programming at Action Aid, and we'll try to connect you with the resources for that. I just wanted to highlight in the Q&A, some of our IATP tech people shared some extra resources on coordination. So at IATP, we have a mini ag network in Minnesota, which we're one of the leaders of in helping coordinate local food initiatives between farm organizations and getting connected with the policy level. So you can follow up with more of that information there if you're interested, and we'll try to get that in the email follow-up as well. I'm going to take a second to look at some of the questions here. Claire, Ben, or Brandon, if you see any of them that you're really eager to comment on, please feel free to. We've got some questions in particular about affordability of unsubsidized foods and how do we make it more affordable for families. I mean, I think any number of you could comment on programs like SNAP or something to that effect. Perhaps Claire or Ben, would you want to talk at all about making food more affordable for folks through a policy initiative?
Maybe I can start us off, Ben, and then you
Yeah.
can jump in. I guess there were also some comments about prices for farmers and well. So I think if you look at sort of both ends of the equation, I think here in Europe, one of the sort of refrain that you hear most often from farmers is we just want to be paid fairly for the products that we produce, and that the corporate structures currently are taking the power away from them to negotiate fair payment basically for their work. So that was one of the other streams that came out of this dialogue that I was talking about that seems to have some interest from European policymakers, is really looking at how do we tackle these unfair trade practices. So possibly a ban on selling goods below the cost of production. So to really enable the farmers to earn a living wage from the work that they do, not from the sort of public money that they would get through a farm bill type program. So that's on the farmer side. And then this dialogue also had a number of interesting recommendations for how to support consumers. I think Ben talked a little bit about sort of public procurement and supporting the demand for sustainable food that way. But one of the other interesting recommendations that they had here was looking at our tax system and how you could potentially review the way taxes are levied against food to really support and reduce taxes on foods that are most sustainable and support sort of lots of fruits and veggies and legumes and things like that. Now, the tax regime is really at the individual European country level, but it's interesting that the tax mandate is with our climate change commissioner, our climate change sort of secretary. So I think that that's really an area on the consumer side that could help support making sure that the way the taxes that we levy on food are really sort of supporting consumers in their affording healthy and sustainable choices. So that's just a couple of the things that they're talking about over here in Europe. I don't know if Ben, if you have more to add from the US.
Yeah, well, I'd say that this has been a long-standing question about, hey, if you improve prices paid to farmers, it's going to increase food prices. But I think one of the key things to look at is the farmer's share of the food dollar, and it is extremely low. Like in the US, it's around, I think, 15 cents of the food dollar actually gets to the farmer. So that points to, of course, who's taking that money along the way. It's the processor, it's the grain companies, the meat companies, and then the grocery stores. And we saw a lot of that during this inflation situation here in the US, where you had companies taking advantage of that situation and price gouging. So I think there's plenty of space for farmers to get a better price, and then for food costs to stay at least where they are, and if not lower them, and just have the companies make less money. So a number of focus on price gouging has sort of increased during the Biden administration, and then they looked a lot about supply chains. They did a number of studies and efforts there. They didn't quite get it rolling aggressively as maybe it could have got rolling a little sooner. But I think that that's an area of focus going forward. And I think Teresa mentioned about the role of state attorney general in the wake of the Justice Department under Trump administration, maybe not as aggressive on those types of issues. I definitely think there's a role for state attorneys general to step in on things like that, including price gouging. So we'll have to see where that goes, but that could be an opportunity.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we've had some amazing questions here in this session. We've got so many more that we would love to get to. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to all of them today. I will be following up via email with the best answers I can provide for you all. Claire, Ben, and Brandon, I just wanted to take one more opportunity here for any comments from any of you about what we've talked about, or if there's anything else that you just had pressing that you wanted to get out before we continue to wrap up.
Shall I start? I mean, I would just say that, as both you and Ben mentioned at the top, the just transition is really the sort of core focus of the work, and that's what we'll be working on. Here in Europe, we have a few green shoots that hopefully, if we push hard and work with our coalition partners, we can advance that work. So that's what we'll do. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks, Claire. Brandon, you want to share any final comments?
Yeah, I feel like we've got this careful dance going on where we with regards to the election, where we don't want to things are not hopeless, right? There are a lot of levers that we have in terms of policy, in terms of organizing, to push back against some of the things that the next administration is going to do. They're going to be really harmful for farmers, for people, for the climate. But at the same time, I feel like sometimes we go too far in that direction and we actually understate the threat. And so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that there are going to be serious threats to people and to the climate, and this next administration is going to be far more organized and effective, most likely, and less incompetent than the first administration. And so our own efforts are going to have to level up as well. And I know that these conversations are happening at the global level as well, at the UN climate negotiations right now, for example, because unfortunately, even though it's just our politics, it does affect everyone in the entire world. So I just want to make sure that we all understand the task in front of us. Thanks.
Thanks, Brandon. Ben, any final comments?
Yeah, thanks for that. I just wanted to reiterate, IATP really works in partnership with other organizations. That's a key sort of tenet of how we work. So we work with farm groups who are farmer member led. We work with trade groups, environmental community, faith groups. And so during the first Trump administration, we went through that, and solidarity was really critical to being effective there, coming together, pushing back together, building power together, changing we obviously need a new narrative about the vision going forward, including on climate change and food. And that is the work that we did before, and that is the work we will do now, just as the Trump administration has gotten probably smarter and more savvier. I think that we have as well. And we'll be ready. And thanks for everyone joining us. And hopefully we can keep the conversation going.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much. In brief, folks, I'm just going to send out an invitation following later. We do have one more Shaping the Future of Food event in December here coming up. And so on that topic will be agroecology. We actually had some questions about agroecology. And so I hope you will join us again for that webinar next month, and we can hopefully cover some of those questions that came up and more, because there's always more to learn as well. So yeah, please join us for that the last session of the fall on December 11th on agroecology. And lastly, I want to invite you to listen to our most recent podcast series on how to fight a factory farm. So covering some of those other topics within the realm of commercial agriculture. I think you'll enjoy this podcast series. And of course, you can check out our website to learn more. We have plenty of resources there about our work in the climate field. So thank you again for coming to the webinar today. I hope you all have an amazing day. You'll receive a follow-up email from me with some answers to more questions and other resources. So thank you again for everyone being here. Ben, Claire, Brandon, you all have been excellent. And thank you for everyone in the webinar. We'll look forward to having you next time.